series of Basler lectures this year. Created in 1994, the Wayne G. Basler Chair of Excellence for the Integration of the Arts, Rhetoric, and Sciences, to give it its full name, is named for a longtime member of the ETSU Foundation, who is a strong advocate of numerous university programs. Its purpose is to bring scholars to ETSU to broaden opportunities for students and the general public in the arts, humanities, and sciences, and to seek to bridge gaps among those disciplines. This year's holder of the Basler Chair is Dr. Leonard, who is well known to many of you in the audience. Dr. Leonard's family has resided in this part of Tennessee since about 1760. He himself has lived in the Middle East for over 35 years, teaching at Quaker schools and at the American University of Beirut. He was also a UNESCO advisor on teacher education for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, and he worked in Jerusalem as management officer of the Program for Assistance to the Palestinian People through the United Nations Development Program. While he's here this semester, Dr. Leonard is teaching two courses, an upper-level graduate history course entitled Origins of the Troubles in the Middle East, and another course entitled Modernizing versus Westernizing Education in the Middle East. As part of the program, also he will present 4 public lectures. This is the second in that series, the remaining ones being on February the 19th and March the 24th. This evening, Dr. Leonard will present the lecture, Arabic and Islamic Origins of the Italian Renaissance. And in this lecture, he will focus on the beginnings of universities in Europe and the advent of academic freedom.
Thank you. I'm supposed to start with a joke, but I can't think of one on this subject. I guess it's almost joke enough that we're talking on something that sounds so esoteric, but I'm not planning to make it that way. Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth of what? The Romans had a very high culture. And if we're talking about rebirth of Roman culture in Italy, we'll find that a large number of writers about the Italian Renaissance write as if the rebirth grew out of the soil of Italy. They almost universally ignore the Arab-Islamic roots. So I'm going to try with maps and with explanations to give you some idea of why we think that the main origins of this rebirth, which happened beginning around 1200, really go back to the Arab-Islamic roots. Now, the Arab-Islamic roots also go back to the Greek roots. Now, let's go back to the question I first asked. What caused the birth of Roman high culture in the first place? Roman high culture is largely a result of the Greek philosophers and tutors that the Romans had. And most of those were slaves, or at least captured people, and they were not always honored. But the Greek culture was very much more intellectual and perhaps very much better with the artistic productions than the Romans. The Romans were famous especially for their engineering. The Romans developed one of the first really good cements in the world for their building. The Greeks built almost entirely with stone without cement, but the Romans had cement. So when they built the dome for the Pantheon, it was largely made of molded cement. And they were very clever. They realized if they put a dome up there of solid cement, it would all fall down, the whole building would fall down from weight. So they made a group of box indentions in the concrete so that there's only about 1/3 as much weight, but it covers the same area over the Pantheon. And that's one of the most interesting buildings in Rome if you go there. But it was the Greek intellectual thinking that caused that rebirth, caused that birth of culture in the Romans. In fact, it was probably the Greek culture was higher than the Romans The British would dispute that with me because they claim to be the modern Rome. But the Greek culture was really far more advanced than the Roman. But the original died not at the time that the Gauls and the Goths and the Huns and the others invaded Rome, but almost 100 years later, when Aristotle was forbidden by the church around in the 7th century, in the 600s. Now it happens that Aristotle got forbidden at the same time in the Eastern Roman Empire. This is the Byzantine Empire. Notice that the heel and the toe of Italy, part of the back of the upper part of Italy, and even close to Rome, were under Byzantium, under the Eastern Roman Empire. But in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the early 500s, a very brilliant young man who was only the nephew of a previous emperor became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire of Byzantium. His name was Justinian, and Justinian became famous as a codifier of the Roman laws. But now let me tell you something that will help you remember that. When Justinian was a young man, he was quite rambunctious, and so to calm him down a bit, his uncle gave him a courtesan, a very beautiful young woman, well known all around Constantinople. Her name was Theodosia. There was a law in Rome, a very ancient law, that plebeians, that is the common people, and especially courtesans and prostitutes, could not marry the young men of good families. Put it the other way. Young men of good families could not marry women of ill repute. They had to keep the family blood pure. So they could only marry other people from their class, in the upper classes. The very first law that Justinian promulgated when he unexpectedly became emperor was the law that he could marry Theodosia, who had been a well-known courtesan, to put it nicely. And so that's the first law he had. Now, you won't have any trouble remembering that, because Theodosia, later on, about 5 years later, there was a coup d'etat attempted. The Emperor Justinian had a ship off the end of the palace in what became Istanbul, Constantinople, with gold and all the things he might need for a good life in case he had to leave. He went out and got on the ship and sent word for her to come. Instead, she went out and rallied all her former customers, who were the officers in the army, and put down the coup d'etat. So he owed his success to her. Now, in that coup d'etat, they burned the Church of St. Irene, which was built by Constantine a little after 330 AD, as a direct replica of another church in Rome, one of the original St. Peter's. There have been about 4 St. Peter's built on the same spot. And so St. Irene's burned to the ground. It was rebuilt, or at least it was burned out. It was rebuilt, and it's now a military museum. If you go to Istanbul, be sure to see it. But he built Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, this beautiful church that has a dome built on pendentives. Pendentives means arches and arches on arches all around, building up to the circle. And that dome covers about the same area as our dome does here, except it's square and not lengthy. Now I do have a joke. When in 1952, the summer of 1952, I'd just come back from a year in the Middle East, and I worked for my uncle, who was a contractor, who had the contract to extend the cafeteria building, later the medical building, and now called Campus Center building. And he sent his nephew, David Leonard, his son rather, David Leonard, who designed our new library here. Incidentally, this building and that library and Straw Hall are all built on the old Leonard farm, our great-grandfather's farm, who used to own from Buffalo Mountain down to here. And his sister sold the rest of the campus. She had just become a widow. She was a Mrs. Lyle. So you're sitting on Leonard property. That's part of the joke. The other joke is when David sent us, when David and I went out to, that was a practice field, and it wasn't draining properly. So we were given the job of surveying it. I held the lines. David was the architect. When we got it finished, his father took one look at it and said, "You built a very nice swimming pool, but it's a little shallow." We'd done our trigonometry upside down. So we weren't very good on trigonometry, and trigonometry is, of course, one of the things the Arabs gave us. But at any rate, we designed that, and now you've covered it all over, so we don't have a memorial over there to my upside-down swimming pool. So now getting back to the Greeks and Byzantium, Justinian was so thankful for staying on as emperor that he tried to force Plato's Academy in Athens. Now, Plato's Academy had started sometime around 400 BC, and this is 500 and something, 536 AD, almost 1,000 years. He wanted that academy to teach Greek Orthodox theology as dogma, and the philosophers at Plato's Academy were still philosophers enough to say, no, we teach philosophy, we do not teach dogma. So he closed Plato's Academy. Now, why is it important for us? Because the people who taught Plato, Neoplatonists, went to the Arab world because that was outside his jurisdiction, and they went to 3 academies that had been started by Alexander the Great 600 years before, around 300 BC, 330 BC. There was an academy at Alexandria. Alexandria is at the mouth of the Nile. Another one at Beirut, and another one at Antioch, Antioch, which is the port city for Aleppo, one end of the Silk Road, which we'll see in a while. But the people who had taught Aristotle at Plato's Academy, Aristotle was a student of Plato and was the teacher of Alexander the Great. And Aristotle is the one that turned deductive reasoning upside down and began to teach inductive reasoning, on which all of our science is based. But those people who were Aristotelians, they went to the Persian-speaking area, to a place called Nineveh, near what we call Mosul today, and another place called Jundi-Shapur. Jundi-Shapur is where Hamadan is, where the oil is in Iran, not about 50 miles east of Basra in Iraq. So, but these were Persian-speaking areas. Now, so it's no accident that all of the mathematics and science that the Arabs and the Muslims produced and invented all came from the eastern Aristotelian part of the Arab world. The Platonic part of the Arab world was in the west. The eastern part was Aristotelian. That was the work of Justinian because he threw them out of the academy. Now, when the prophet saw that he was going to die, he said to his people, "Utlab al-ilm, now fi-Sin." Search for truth, even to China. In other words, truth is important. Go after truth. He also said, God loves the ink of scholars more than the blood of martyrs. We need to teach that all around the world right now. But this gives you some idea of how important learning was to the early Muslims. When the early Muslims captured Antioch, Beirut, and Alexandria, and later Nineveh and Jundi-Shapur, the very first people they tried to convert were those people in those academies that had been started by Alexander the Great some 900 years, 800-something years, 900 years earlier. So the early Muslims were very, very much interested in education. Those academies later became centers of translation. Now, I don't mean just machine places that do translating. The Arabs all will tell you that it was the translated great books of all the world that helped them to become so quickly creative, because within 150 years of Muhammad, the Arabs were doing some of the most creative things in the history of the world. Gave us trigonometry, they really started chemistry and algebra, they did great advances in medicine, and a lot of things in mathematics, that algebra and so forth, that I don't know much about. But these were done very quickly after Islam began, largely because of many of the things that the Muslims learned in their passionate interest to understand Islam in the first 100 years. There were great discussions going on, discussions and discussions and discussions. For 220 years they discussed, and they couldn't agree on the commentaries for the Quran. The Prophet had said that there were up to 7 commentaries for each, 7 interpretations for each line in the Quran, and they couldn't agree on which of his sayings and which of his doings to include in the hadith, or part of the Sharia law, and they couldn't agree on the agreements which would take the place of anything that was not covered by the Quran or hadith. And about that time, in 813, a man named Ma'mun, who was educated and whose mother was educated, whose grandfather was a professor at Jundishapur, a professor of Aristotelian philosophy. This man was a rationalist, and he became caliph. He went up and got Turkish mercenaries, he'd been converted to Islam, to help him defeat his brother and become the caliph. So he was caliph 813 to 833, and there were 3 successors after him. In 857, the 4th caliph, Mutawakkil, after him, changed back to being traditionalist. After not being able to agree on what was the Sharia law for 250 years, suddenly the traditionalists got together and they settled Sharia law and set it in concrete, and it hadn't been changed since 900. But this rationalism was a very strong part of the tradition of Islamic education. Now let's get up to what happened in Italy. Italy was partly under Byzantium, and Sicily was under Tunis. Sicily had tenant farmers. And the landlords lived in Tunis. It had been Muslim for 400 to 500 years. And when the Crusades began in 1088, about 25, I think 23, Normans from northwest France came down into Italy. They missed the boat to go on the crusade. So they went wandering around south, and they found that in this part of southern Italy, there were lots of noblemen with large estates that weren't very well guarded. These men were wearing armor and riding on horses, and so they started capturing these places. The next thing you knew, they had captured all of southern Italy here, and then they wandered over to Sicily and captured Sicily. So they got the Pope to call them kings of the 2 Sicilies, southern Italy and Sicily. And these people had come from Normandy, so they were Normans, but they became kings. The last of the Normans in the 1100s, about 1180, 1185, married the son of Frederick Barbarossa. This is Swabia here, Germany. This is the Holy Roman Empire. And you know the joke, it's neither Holy Roman nor an empire. But Constantine started this in 800. He was crowned king by emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day 800.